All right. Hi, Michelle. It's
Hi, Michelle.
funny to be two Michelles on the call. but, but thank you so much for joining me in this call and agreeing to share some of your wisdom about creative practice and more. Just for context, I'm excited to talk with you after being aware of your work for it's at least 20 years. It's since the mid 90s when we both lived in Washington, D.C. And I knew of you and your work, and I was following from a distance. And then through social media, we just kept sort of crossing paths lightly. And then more recently, as we introduced this month-long inquiry into creative practice, I did a search online for that term, creative practice, and images. I thought, let me find an image that goes along with an invitation that we might extend into this inquiry. And one of your frameworks came up, and it's called 9 Practices for Cultivating Creative Aliveness. It was gorgeous, and this phrase really caught me. I thought, that's my sense of the role of creative practice in thrivability, in creating a more thrivable world. And the content of it seemed really compelling. And then I saw it was you, and, and I thought, oh, fantastic. Let me reach out again and see if we could have a conversation. And we did, and it was fabulous. So here we are recording it this time so others can benefit from your wisdom, your insights, and just the energy of our exchange. So that's the context. And I'm excited to be able to introduce some other people to your work. Maybe to hand it over to you in a playful volley, you could just introduce yourself and your work. Let us know.
Well, yeah, thank you. And I remember, I think it was likewise, I had been following your work too. And then I think it was 10 years ago, 8 years ago, sometime where we actually had a call
Right.
and going in and out of following. And I see our work as, sort of like a Venn diagram with all this sort of aliveness, natural creativity, how to bring things to thriving life. And then just with some differences and complementary, yet toward that same, larger mission of how do you bring systems, individuals, structures, people, groups, organizations into creative, alive thrivability, basically. And so I, do it through the sort of the lens and the umbrella of creative emergence, and the creative practice part is one of it. I'm very interested in both creativity to create new life-giving, generative, thrivable structures, but also using the life-giving structures to generate and systems to generate more creativity. And very much in, bringing in various aspects of creative process, like I've done years of improv theater, so I do a lot of improv-based principles and practices or storytelling or visual thinking or dance, movement, and embodiment, body work, all kinds of things, but trying to say that we are so much more than human thinkers. We're human beers, and we're human creators, and we're human engagers. And so if we're going to be approaching how do you create a life-giving system, environment, structure, organization, group, team, one of my approaches is do different practices and engage with more of the whole brain, the whole being, the whole self, including the verbal and the analytical and the talk only, but more, whole system, and also the creative intelligence and the emotional intelligence and the embodied intelligence, the owning it, the being it. So all of that is to say, in my work, I do it through coaching, I do it through or facilitation, I do it through coaching facilitators and people how to bring more creative aliveness into and their own creative uniqueness into what they do. So I'd say creative uniqueness is as equally as important to me in my work as creative aliveness, that it's everyone's uniqueness, which creative practices bring out. Everyone's uniqueness work together in a co-creative aspect to transcend and include the larger whole, to where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It's the thing that you bring, Michelle, your unique set of gifts, skills, talents, experiences, creativity, perspectives, memes, paradigms, stories, all the things you carry. And then if I came together with you, what we can co-create can include what we both have and then be something larger versus, and to me, that's the big piece of emergence. And it's also what I see, resonate with in the work you're doing, that it's expanding the playing field. It's making it bigger and more alive rather than chopping away parts. So we go into a compromise. So it's a yes anding instead of a no budding, or
I love it. So much goodness in there. I'm hearing, as I often do, the patterns of living systems that I talk about at every chance because I find them so useful. So I'm hearing, and there's parts, there's relationships as unfolding process.
Yeah.
And there's emergent wholeness, and there's life. There's whatever spark it is that animates us and makes us alive that we can tune into and align with, rather than try to control every aspect. So the creative uniqueness, is about my divergent gifts, my specific and unique offerings, and creating a space in which I can interact with you, with others, so that we can enable co-creation and emergence of new wholeness. Yeah,
I love that. And the part you said, that spark that animates. I call it the creative source, the source of creativity. It's life-generating life source that we all have within us. It's the animating life force, right? Like there's an animating life force that will have a flower bloom, a tree branch, an ecosystem emerge. Well, we all have an animating life force in us around our creativity. And unfortunately, as our organizational systems and structures have been designed in ways that actually not only just don't support it, but kind of snuff that energy out. And there aren't a lot of channels for engagement around that energy, or sometimes it'll come through and then has to go through this system and so part of it is, how do we create the environment? How do we create the conditions for part of creative practice? In my viewpoint is creating the conditions for creativity to emerge. Both of you are doing it at home by yourself, or towards structuring a business or anything you might be doing. But also if you're facilitating a room or facilitating a group, or you're leading a group or creating an organization, what are the conditions for creativity to emerge? And what are the conditions for purposeful, useful, relevant creativity to emerge?
Nice.
There's creative expression, which is amazing and awesome. And then, but I know that you and I both work, given that we work a lot with organizations or communities and systems, that there's a creativity that serves the objectives or the mission or a larger purpose too. And, and so that's, I kind of distinguish that. And even though you might use similar practices for both sometimes.
Okay, so I have a more detailed framework for those 4 patterns, in which I talk about that relational, the second design principle. I talk about it there as practical play. And it sounds like that's what you're talking about.
Oh, I love it. Yeah. I love it. Right. And you hear it as like serious play or yes. One of the things that I think is devastating is when you see play, which will naturally want to emerge out of any group if there's a goodwill, if there's some good energy in the group. it'll naturally happen, but then and often inevitably, unless it's actually you're in a creative thinking workshop or some kind of focus, somebody will go, okay, all right, enough of the silliness, now let's get back to work.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I know true to you with the and me is the play actually informs the work. It's an essential.
Mm-hmm.
It's the essential ingredient in it.
Mm-hmm.
Just like in nature, I mean, nature, animals learn through play. Human beings learn through play. We are designed to learn through play and lighthearted and playfulness, and the brain research supports that. Then when you're playing, you're more endorphins, more cross hemispheric work,
Mm-hmm.
more neural pathways. So it's almost crazy to
Mm-hmm.
snuff out the play in a room and want people to really be more creative. So
Mm-hmm.
I love what you said about play, and that's I think that's one of the conditions. Is
Mm-hmm.
that
I
play
do
is
too.
part of the process. Yeah.
It's such a shame that we've bought into the story that play is the opposite of work, when it seems
Yeah.
to be the highest form of work, the most effective form of work, and or at least of
Yeah.
innovation and collaboration and creating new possibilities.
Absolutely, certainly informs it. And it's not just random disconnected play, but play is sort of like purposeful play, or play that we can lead to purpose.
Mm-hmm.
um, I think people are afraid of play because play in and of itself, if you just kind of let it go, it can go all over the place and whatever, and you're thinking, well, we have goals and we have objectives and we have things we have to do. But if you create a container for it, if
Mm-hmm.
you're facilitating it, you create a container for it,
Mm-hmm.
or even yourself, if you kind of, a container could be a timeline. I'm going to allow myself to kind of go into divergent space for the next hour and a half,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever it is, or for the next 3 days. But I find that if you create a container for the divergent play, and then you go into convergence, then you can move forward. If it's just divergent, 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 I think people are afraid to go into divergence, because divergence means the unknown. Divergence
Right.
means things aren't controllable. They're not know what it's
Exactly.
gonna. It could look silly, goofy. They're not going to be. But if you come back into convergence, I think
Mm-hmm.
people are more likely to kind of go with it, and
Mm-hmm.
less likely to um, just resist it.
Right. Right. This desire to control is strong, and but taught also. It's we're taught that we need to control, that that's the best way. And I like what you're saying about not moving into a complete lack of control. There is a container, there is an intention to your work and what you guide people through. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a direction can still be there. Or I know, for example, if I'm designing creativity center, creative thinking workshops or creativity for clients, we still look at the objectives. There's still a direction, a focus.
Mm-hmm.
Even thinking, even in natural systems, there's still like an embed, like there's still a DNA, there's still a blueprint, there's still
Mm-hmm.
something of what we're going, but you're still playing and exploring and discovering along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, it also depends, what is your intention? Is your intention just to have fun? Then go out and dance and whatever. And then the
Right.
container might just be, I'm dancing from 8
Right.
p.m. to midnight,
And the music is a container as well, the rhythm.
yeah, all of the conditions, right, help create the container. But if it's something, so I think depending what the purpose is and what the objectives are, would determine the type of container you create and the conditions that are essential for it.
Mhm.
But I think play, or some level of playfulness,
Mhm.
is essential for it, no
Mhm.
matter what.
I do
That's been,
too.
yeah.
And speaking of essential, when I started digging into your work more avidly recently, and this inquiry into creative practice, I first thought that this was a set of techniques to put into the toolbox. And the more I learn, the more I think this is foundational.
Yeah, yes.
This is the foundation of all else. If we're going to create the conditions for life to thrive, that is fundamentally a creative practice, isn't it?
Yeah, that's like a meta creative practice, right?
Right.
I agree. I think it's foundational. So when, there's, and foundational is, if you think of everything as like a fractal or a whole lot, everything's, so at one level, there's a creative practice that could just look like a technique or an activity.
Mm-hmm.
Technique, or I do my morning practice from the X time to, and that's one level of creative practice. Another creative practice is you zoom out a bit and then you're thinking about strategizing or container creating. And then another level is like looking at principles or paradigms or value memes or, belief systems, the narratives that are underneath everything. I mean, and then like changing things, how low down the iceberg do you want to go at kind of a change at looking. And so there's sort of a creative practice for all of it, but the foundation, I love what you're saying. That's exactly what I said there. The foundation, creative practice is about foundations, and the foundation, I believe, is creative, is creating a container for creativity to emerge. It's what nature does.
Right,
So
right.
we have a model.
Yes, exactly. So we seem to need to overcome this idea that only some few freaks
Yeah.
are creative, and
Yeah.
that's a fluffy and optional and not really useful set of activities. And instead to see that life is creative. We are that's the nature of being alive, right?
Yeah, rather than exactly like label it as creatives are creative, because the truth is, there's a difference between being creative, which everybody's infinitely creative, and talented or gifted in a type of creative expression. Somebody may be an amazing writer. It's not to say everybody everybody can write like William Shakespeare, everyone can create like Leonardo da Vinci, but everybody's infinitely creative. Some people are just creative in different ways. And I think we falsely siloed off people to think they're not creative by saying, whether it was in their family or whether it was in their school or who knows where it originated. But somebody's like, oh, you're not creative, you're this type. And some people carry that. And I think part of the work is to actually, that's one of the parts of the iceberg that need to kind of get looked at underneath someone, is to unravel any kind of faulty programming or belief systems that they're not already infinitely creative, and that what society called creative is just a small portion of what creativity is.
I'm seeing, you were talking about this a little bit earlier, that there's this fractal pattern of creative practice at multiple levels. So I can have a personal practice, and then we can have interpersonal practices, and then we can have collective practices. And even you talked about paradigms and worldviews, that that foundational acknowledgement that life is creative and therefore we are creative.
Yes.
We can bring that into all of those levels. Yeah.
Yes, and think about the difference of the kind, a lot of creativity is about responding to the questions we ask. So they say you want to create differently, ask different questions. Well, there's a very big different question that's binary. Am I creative? Yes or no. Versus how am I creative? In what ways might I create? What's my role to contribute through my creativity? How is life creative? If we start asking open-ended generative questions, assuming that life is creative and we're all creative, then that opens so much more we could do than when we ask binary yes/no questions. Am I creative?
Right. Right.
There's not a lot to go through there. Just, in what ways am I creative? In what ways have I blocked my creativity? And what else can creativity mean? And then we start to open the playing field for just our own exploration. And also, if we go in to any group we work with, whether we're facilitating or leading or coaching or anything, assuming that everybody in the room is infinitely creative and can contribute things we can't possibly imagine.
Beautiful.
That's a real gift there versus I need to keep everybody into what's comfortable for me as the facilitator or my framework. If we assume that everyone in the room can yes and creatively to who we are and what we think, and that at any given moment our worldview can shift based on someone's contribution in the room, that opens up the field. That's part of creating the conditions, is our own mindset and heart set and
Mm-hmm.
world framework.
I love it. I love it. Have you heard of Rabbi Joshua Abraham Heschel, or I can't remember the first two names, but he talks about radical amazement. And
No, I love that term.
yeah, it reminds me of that stance, just to be ready to be amazed. Radical. I have a friend who absolutely lives that, and she's such a delight to be with and is generative. There is this sense of a fertile playing field, to use some of your words, around her.
I love that too. I mean, I had not heard that term, but I love that.
Mhm.
And imagine if we all just expected that, how different the world would be.
Yeah.
Going back to what you said about control, because that's a huge thing. I think people are terrified of the unknown. They're the three of the biggest fears I found in my own work around what people grapple with in their creative emergence process: the fear of failure, the fear of being wrong, and those can overlap, but they're different. But mostly the fear of the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if all other fears can usually fit into one of those.
Mm-hmm.
And so people are terrified of the unknown. So it's like that expression, the devil, you'll go back to something that's not even working, but it keeps you out of unknowing. Mm-hmm. And I think there's this place, this chasm, like a chasm between what we know and what we don't know. And when we get to the edge of what we know, it's the most uncomfortable place for a lot of people, because we're really in like a deer in a headlight right there. But then there's this new known that's kind of across this big chasm, and we have to we get a choice. Do we turn back, go into what we remember, what others have told us, what's familiar, what's comfortable, what people outside of us say, what authority, or do we kind of build a bridge in the fog, crossing over in the unknown, which can be super uncomfortable. There's mistakes. It's a discovery process. But I think if we commit to it and we just go, it's not even having to love the unknown or be comfortable, but it's just accepting it. Like right now I'm in the unknown, I'm in a fog, and I might be in the fog for a while. And then you go into discovery, you change the fear of the unknown, at least into discovery. Like, I'm in the unknown, I'm uncomfortable, whatever it is, and I'm discovering. That helps you kind of get across that. And then all of a sudden the unknown, you start to discover stuff in the unknown. Mm-hmm. And that helps us. And I think when that's a creative practice is turning the fear of the unknown into discovery. Mm-hmm. When you do that enough times, when someone starts to embody and own the discovery mindset, the unknown becomes much less scary, and it becomes much less of a fearful process and more like, well, let's try it. And like, this didn't work out. It's an iteration. Let's try something else.
Right. It's almost like building a muscle or building muscle memory. I have experienced the unknown and moved into discovery, and it turned out okay. And I know how to do that. So it seems really important for society that we create more practice grounds where people can safely build those muscles and build that confidence. And I had a conversation recently about how the etymology of the word confidence is with faith. And it's faith because I have experienced, I'm adding my own interpretation, but that I know how to do this. I know how to work through the unknown and into discovery. And it seems like, as you were describing that, the fear and the need to control and the desire to stick with the things I know and the people I know, that's a large part of the dynamic in the world right now in politics. That there's move towards nationalism and division that I think is rooted in that fear and need to control. And it's understandable because we all haven't had an experience of moving through ambiguity and change. So I'm seeing this as a real urgent need for schools and for organizations to create containers in which people can experience their own ability to move through ambiguity and change and discovery.
Yeah, and hold ambiguity for longer periods of time. I
Mhm.
think it's when everything's neatly laid out and you know how everything's going to be, or it's just A to B. There's an ease in that, but you then get out of the habit of being, in this unknown adventure or
Mhm.
this unknown space. So what I think I've noticed that with my own clients, that those that can hold more are more comfortable with holding ambiguity and holding the unknown somehow navigate more easily the huge levels of unknown that we're all in
Mhm.
for who knows how long.
Right.
And so that's a piece of it. That's why I think developing a healthy relationship with the unknown, through the discovery mindset, and I know like one of the practices, of course, that really helps with it, and I refer everyone to is, take some improv theater classes. Because
Mhm.
if nothing else, it's a low risk, um, low stakes space to learn high risk, high stakes behaviors of being with ambiguity. Um,
Mhm.
or just have, for some people, it's already comfortable, but a lot of people it's not. Put a blank, empty canvas with no idea what you're going to paint. And
Mhm.
just as you go, discover, do a discovery painting. So you're discovering as you go. Again, in and of itself, and it's not about how it looks, but it's about developing a relationship with not knowing and letting something emerge, letting something unfold. Because both the work both you and I do, that has to do with emergence, always has an unexpected something. That's
Mhm.
emergence by itself means there's some surprise, right?
Mhm.
Something
Mhm.
unpredictable emerges. And
Right.
how fun to get back to when you were kids and the unknown was an exciting thing.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I believe it's embedded. We have nature on our side. It's embedded in us to like the surprise of the unknown.
Mhm.
And then we also have it kind of in our ancestral DNA to fear the unknown, from the caveman, the mammoth comes out like you got it. But we have parts of our inner child that loves the unknown and everything's a surprise. And so if we can just get a little bit of that
Mhm.
playfulness back to the discovery process, it just helps us navigate it, I think, more
Mhm.
easily.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. It brings to mind ways that we can support people in feeling safe enough to
Yeah.
move into the unknown and know that the mammoth is not today's equivalent of the mammoth because there are real threats
They
and
are real.
fear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And that brings a good point. I think it's not about this Pollyanna attitude of, wow, if you just embrace the unknown and befriend the unknown, nothing bad can ever happen. I mean, life has real stuff
Mhm.
that's challenging. Um, but a couple things. One is, first, think of how many people just live in fear of things that don't ever happen, or so that's a lot of creative energy put towards something that might never happen versus putting it towards something you want to create. And the second part is that with the fear of like going into the unknown, um, you're more empowered to influence an outcome or at least contribute to something in your piece of the world, whether it's just you for yourself or your family or people you might facilitate or lead or teach or work with. But you're more empowered to facilitate to an outcome that you do want if you're just willing to work with the unknown.
Mhm. It's sort of claiming your creative power.
That's, oh, yes, that's it.
in a situation.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
owning it and saying, there are things that can happen at any given time
Hmm.
that you don't know. And there are things that you might even fear that have real potential to happen.
Hmm.
Uh, but instead of sitting around waiting and fearing, it's creating, go from waiting to creating.
Hmm.
Use that unknown space as a creative space.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it.
So, as I was talking about helping people feel safe, things that came to mind were universal basic income, sort of structural, tangible things, or whatever makes sense to make sure people aren't attacked by the mammoth.
Yeah.
It seems like there's something also in our relationships, in community, and building those bridges
Yeah.
that create safety as well. Have you seen that? What are your
Well, again, I think it's like the microcosm of like your own personal relationships to then if you facilitate, like facilitating a room, to organizational relationships, to community relationships, to larger relationships between states or countries or So, yeah, well, a lot of research has shown, and I don't know that I've read research that has shown otherwise, that a psychological safe space does help people, is part of one of the conditions for
Mhm.
more thriving creative practices, for more creative aliveness. Again, you can look throughout history and people have created amazing things in the most treacherous circumstance. So it's not the only way to create. I mean, often necessity breeds creativity. Horrific circumstances have done it. But
Right.
when you have a choice and people aren't in those horrific circumstances, or even if they are, if you create a psychologically safe space, um, that does help it feel, people then will let their guard down, will
Mhm.
let the controls down, and that's when you can then access more of your divergent thinking, your creative ways of being.
Mhm.
Like that's what play often is,
Mhm.
because it feels a psychological safe space. So just think about even animals, how they move, or how people move when they're in play. It's much more open and flowing and fluid versus how they move when they're in protection,
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know, frozen or defensive. And just
Right.
think about, and just a practice for people to even go into themselves is, imagine, go into play and feel that in your body and feel how, start to think of things as you're in this playful mode. That's going to look different. They say, okay, now go into just protect yourself, look good, put the ego. So
Right.
I think one of the challenges that we have is most of us have not been socialized or educated in environments that were designed to support our creativity, right?
Mhm.
And so now we see at all levels of the society a lot of people who get into leadership positions who might have I mean, I think more so now you see a lot of creative, innovative people in that, less so years ago, but you still see a lot of people in positions that don't necessarily know how to bring out or create the psychologically safe space for their teams or for other people around them. Or so, uh, and that's, anything from an organizational level to a political level to a, social level. Uh, there's something to really be said, what you were talking about is the psychological,
Mhm.
making it safe.
Right. Right. So much. Got
Yeah.
three different questions going from all that you've been saying. So one of the things that you made me think of is that over the years, as I've talked about thriving and thrivability, I don't know how many times people have said, I can't talk about thriving. I'm barely surviving, or I haven't gotten through sustainability yet. And you want me to talk about thrivability. And what I will often say is, you'll you'll never get out of survival mode with survival thinking. As you were saying, people, it's a very different experience to be open and creative than it is to to be shut down,
Yeah.
and so it's not a linear process that we first get through survival and then can eventually get to the utopia of thriving. It's more of a mindset, which is why I talk about thriveability. How do
I
we
love it.
ability to thrive?
Yeah, the ability to thrive. That's great. Because
Mm.
you're right, it isn't linear. It's
Mm.
not like, well, first you master sustainability, then you go to thrivability, or first you master everyday living, analytical living, then you go to creative thinking, or
Right.
first you master. It is nonlinear, and that's what's been kind of pushed aside in our world is the lesser value of nonlinear thinking.
Hmm.
Nonlinear thinking and nonlinear way of being and approaching, because when you're using the whole brain, not just left brain dominant thinking, but you use your whole self and your whole body and your whole brain, there's a lot of nonlinearity. If you
Hmm.
look out in nature, there's a lot of nonlinearity.
Hmm.
There's both orderly, linear and nonlinear. And so I think surviving, adapting a thriving mindset or adapting a discovery mindset is actually the thing that can help you move from survive to thrive instead of waiting till you get to survive.
Hmm.
And that's
Hmm.
why I think almost like, a Maslow's hierarchy, if come from a creative emergence lens, would be more dimensionalized. It wouldn't just be like that. It would
Right.
have a more dimensional, it'd be more of a dimensional dance than a linear sequential step.
Hey, I write something similar in my book, actually, that
Oh, awesome.
it's more facets of thrivability. Yeah. Oh, I like that a lot.
Well, and I think that's another place where our work overlaps. It's breathing in the dimensionality, going from the flat to the multi-dimensional, going from the sequential to the sequential and non-sequential.
Hmm.
Um, Both, going from where time is sequential, and then things come out of space time. That's the creativity. A lot of it is something just kind of comes out of space time. In your sort of whole brain. You all of a sudden get the aha that doesn't necessarily fit the logical sequence.
Right. You
And
can't necessarily schedule it at 5 past 10. I will have a brilliant idea.
exactly. And if I'll do these three steps, the fourth one is going to be the brilliant idea. You do everything, you create all the conditions, and then at some unknown time, the aha moment might happen. Or
Mhm.
you might get aha moment, you know, um, at any given time. And then then you could go back. So it's always like the divergence, convergence, then you go back, then half the practice is, recording it, knowing what's a good idea, or recording it so you don't forget it when you get it, and then fleshing it out and analyze it, and maybe yes-anding, diverging with it for a while, because the first time the first idea is not necessarily the best one. It might be 5 iterations out, and then you finally like, right. And so not immediately
Mm.
going into binary, yeah, that's good, or no, but like,
Right.
oh, that feels alive. Let's explore that.
Right. So you're reminding me of, I, I talk about stewardship more than leadership. And to me, stewardship is creating the conditions. It's tending, as if
Mm,
tending a garden,
mhm.
or tending to a child's life. It's not something that you can control, but you can create the conditions for life to thrive within that piece of land, or within the life of the child. And I define stewardship as the combination of reverence and responsibility. Reverence because it's alive, because that life is beyond my control or comprehension, and it's worthy of wonder and awe and reverence. But then responsibility, and that is kind of the ability to respond to what's emerging, as you're saying. Um, so creating the conditions for both of those to come to bear is how I'm thinking of stewardship.
I love it. I have not heard stewardship defined in that exact way before. And I resonate more with that than I've heard it in the past. I love it because the reverence is that awe, wonder, the call, what's calling, what can be, what's all. And the responsibility is sort of more the structure and the commitment and both the responding and the irony is that within responsibility lies the seeds of freedom, or the seeds of freedom paradoxically are in the seeds of responsibility. Anything we take responsibility for, we have a capacity to shift, shape, form, change. If we, in our world, of what we have, what we can take responsibility for, anything we put outside of ourselves to not take any responsibility for, we get disempowered.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a empowerment and responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of to put what your word reverence in sort of my emergence frame, it's like the reverence is sort of also the reason for doing it. This
right.
that larger awe, the larger call.
Right. It's sort of rooted in curiosity and compassion. I feel love, I feel some connection, and I'm open and curious. And then what you're describing and how that gives us power, it's that claiming your creative power, right? Don't just back and
that responsibility isn't just heavy, oh, it's my responsibility or whatever. That responsibility with it comes with it is creative power.
Nice.
And that leads to a new level. When you have creative power, there's a level of freedom in that, in your choices and what you choose and how you show up and what you do. When you're not in touch with your creative power, you're kind of more going through the motions.
Yeah. So speaking of going through the motions, I frequently see articles about innovation, and they're often published by major universities. And I'm thinking of one in particular that was recent, and it's so mechanistic, and innovation is sort of an output of a mechanistic process, as if it's so many gears and levers. So do you see that too? And
oh my God, yes. In fact, when I do innovation workshops, I will say, let's say we're not allowed to say the word innovation. What are we talking about, first of all? So that's part of it, because just the idea of the buzzword itself can kind of get in the way of real creative thinking. But as opposed to, so one of the principles of emergence is replacing the mechanistic language with organic, holistic process language. So absolutely, because if that speaks to the deeper mechanistic metaphors and narratives that we had, from pre-industrial. I mean, I'm not even sure when they, emerged at first, but
I trace it to the modern era, the ancient Greeks.
The ancient Greek, right?
Right.
Okay. Yeah, right. And so, going back into weaving in nature metaphors, like your word tending, which I love, and which was also one of the 9 practices of aliveness. It's and nurturing and nourishing and compassion. Bringing that in along with structuring and building and forming and shaping, that looks very different than when you're just acting like people, or even goals are more mechanistic. I mean, think of even like the word output and just, so yeah, if we form questions from with everyday, more organic, natural language, we're going to come up with different solutions than if we form questions embedded in the mechanistic language. Because we can always come up with more organic, creative, alive solutions and then transfer them. Which is, it's easier if you leave the language come up with other new ideas and then transfer it back, versus if you kind of stay stuck in the mechanistic language through the whole innovation process.
Mm-hmm.
That's my opinion. I know there might be others that don't feel
No,
that way.
I'm with you. That's my experience too. I worked with two different organizations that, in separate geographies, but were community organizations that helped citizens develop projects. And each of them called themselves an umbrella organization.
Mm.
And to each I said, what if they were stuck and struggling, and there just wasn't enough life and aliveness? And I said, what if you think of yourselves not as this inanimate thing, but as the fertile soil for community projects? What does that bring up? And what skills does it help you realize that you need to develop or that you already have? And what relationships does that bring to mind, and what new activities? And it's transformational, just that switch.
Just that's what I love it. I love it. Yes. Just the switch of thinking, like how we think about, if everyday language, just what we accept as normal, can feel very heavy. People, they always say the words like people are always struggling or battling, or and what if we just change that concept to more of like the dance, or the engagement, or the discovery. All of a sudden when we switch heavy words into more open, spacious words. So it's not like light words, like pretending something, but everything. There seems to be a lot of not only mechanistic metaphors, but war metaphors that have just made its way into our everyday language.
Mm-hmm.
And so what if we switch that into more compassionate metaphors, and more natural, organic metaphors, or more metaphors that have spaciousness in it? And then when we start to ask questions from more possibilities thinking,
Mm-hmm.
versus just a mechanistic thinking. And I think people, it's hard to support it. It's so permeating, because people will always go, well, if only so and so would do this, then this would happen. But so and so also was raised in the same,
Right.
with the same mechanistic language, that unless somebody consciously stops, becomes aware, questions everything, and chooses to break their patterns and reshift it, they're just going to be, they could still be a good person. It doesn't mean
Right.
they're not a good person. They're just operating from a more a sort of a less creative playing field language.
Right. Right. And possibly worldview.
And worldview. Yes.
Yeah. I really like the how the concept of generativity and regeneration are becoming more common. I think those are in some ways synonyms for creativity. What is generative here? And so the language that you're describing is more generative language. Yeah.
Yes, and I know you use that generative, regenerative all the time. I know that's a big piece of your work too, and my own. That I have my model is holistically generative work, which is financially, creatively, meaning, purposefully, and serving the greater good. But it's because generative assumes, in my mind, and why it fits into creativity, thrivability, everything we're talking about, is because it assumes something life generating more life. Something will continue to generate more. Mm-hmm. It's not just static. It's not just, and then it stops. It's just like in nature. Nature continues to generate until it dies. It just keeps going.
And even then it's still generating.
Right. Generating. Yes, then it's regenerating and generating. So everything in nature. Yeah. So if we really, and that's what I love, and I know this from following your work, that you have been so committed to this, and you are really out there doing it in so many ways, and it's such a great service, but really committing to using that, nature, like using those more natural systems and living systems of our guide, and bringing those metaphors and that language and that way of thinking and being in. So that in itself is a huge creative practice, the shift of the world line. And then there are little creative practices within that. You could do it for any of us that do any kind of work toward a more generative, creative living system is, how can we bring our practices to life for those, knowing that people are so creative, so diverse, in how they learn and how they create. And I know just from the work I do there, if sometimes some people come to life as soon as you bring visual thinking in and not the verbal, a whole group will come to life that might not be with verbal talking only. As soon as you bring storytelling in, other people come to life. They're animated storytellers. They think in what, as soon as you bring, theater-based or characters or role play, as soon as you start to, I love doing things like literally anthropomorphizing concepts. Have a concept, have an identity, and have a personality, and so when you start to talk as a person, starting to pretend they're a concept, and they start to talk from it, you get a whole set of different things than if you talk about it. And part of that is because it sounds weirder at first, but it actually feels safer. It's like wearing a mask. When people wear masks, they say different things than their everyday self. When you embody and take on the role or play a character of a concept, you will actually think different things about the concept than if you're like if I'm Michelle talking about the concept.
Right.
Because you get to leave your identity and there's a freedom in that. Or if you act non-verbally, you just act like, something, a concept or a solution or a problem, and you walk around the room doing it, you're going to discover more facets of the problem or solution or concept than if you're just talking from our everyday habitual self.
Right. It makes so much sense. And it makes me think, listening to you talk about how different people light up and come alive and find permission to share their gifts because of different invitations. It makes me think that leadership or stewardship is a creative practice as well, right? Creating the conditions creatively.
Yes, I think so. I think that's what creative leadership really is working on your own inner creative landscape, and allowing you and creating it for others, creating the conditions for others to really expand and navigate their creative landscape and express it out. And that is it's simultaneously easy and challenging. Because we will bump up against all of our own inner belief systems and limitations, as well as the resistances in the groups and other people's, and as well as the social norms and the assumptions that are out there. For example, this, one of my real beliefs is one day we're going to look back and we're going to go, gosh, remember there was a time where we would just show up with lined paper and black and white, or rather than color and drawing everything and not just cool images online, but actually drawing things out. That there's sort of a lost art of some of that, where a lot of brain research shows that the hand-eye, the brain to the hand actually offers a new level of thinking. And so just the idea that we were kind of left brain dominant more than whole brain in everything we did, or that we, everybody's like sitting up straight, that we don't have a culture that valued more movement throughout the workday or more kinds of things. And so I think one day we'll look back and go, that was crazy, the way we can look back now at some of the practices in the 30s. And
no wonder there were so many problems. Look at how we worked, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
And the machine metaphor for human beings and human feeling, and also the idea of, how do you use, rather than take out the emotional aspect of work, how do you use the emotional aspect? Because the emotional aspect is also tied into passion and purpose and a sense of caring and contribution, which is essential to the creative process. So more questioning, how do we use all of who we are in a generative way,
Mhm.
life-giving way?
Beautiful. I want to ask one more question, and then we can close, although I'd love to keep talking with
I
you.
know, I always feel like we could talk forever.
I do
Uh,
too. So I just wonder if you have a favorite story of someone or some group that you've helped embrace everything, not everything, but the basics of what we've been talking about. Is there a story that you love to share? You would.
I don't know if there's a favorite one, but because I have a lot of different ones, but the one that came into my mind when you said it, I know if I had time, I could think of other, probably even juicier ones. But I have a corporation that was one of my clients, and they were a creative group. They were the creative services group, and they've actually done commercials like you've probably seen. They're like a big corporate. But one of the things that they hired me for was because they were all already very creative, that the director said it was like herding cats, because they're all super creative but have ideas of their own. And so their meetings would be, it would take forever to get things done. They'd have to redo and have meetings over and over again, because everybody was always vying for their idea or what idea is right. And so just through the simple learning of some yes anding, so I went in there and I did a co-creation workshop for creatives, what you could do it for people who don't think they're creative at all, which is more what I work with. But in this case, that wasn't it. But we did a co-creation workshop, and we learned different principles and different practices. But one of them was just the practice of yes anding and before and going into divergence before you go into convergence. And so so you'd actually have to talk about, so people could share their ideas, but everybody would have to, before they couldn't, they had to say why that idea was good, and why that I was, so several people would have to tell them why that idea was good. And then they'd have to add things to that idea as part of the game. Like, we agreed, we'll do it. Well, what started happening was, it turned out like everyone's idea was good when it got yes anded and added. And often the first iteration that came out was nothing like what eventually happened. And so we went from the framework of whose idea is best to discovery mindset, and yes, discovery and yes anding.
Mm-hmm.
And so we spent a day doing that, and we got, I mean, they fully brought out so many of their ideas, so now they had different ideas they could use, and everybody was heard, because even the person whose idea it wasn't, they've now added on, like, I've added on to your idea, you've added on to mine, now it's our idea.
Right.
And so one, it became their ideas. But then the director wrote me back a couple of months later saying that their meetings, they went from calling them, instead of calling them meetings, or kind of their own dreaded, like, who's going to win, sessions, they changed it to, they now call them discovery sessions. They don't use the word meetings at all in that department. They call them discovery sessions, and it completely changed their culture. And I know some other people, sometimes when they put principles of, I call them principles of creative engagement, they could be principles of thrivability or principles of improv, whatever. But when they put them in the different boardrooms, or they start to put them in the into the culture, just the principles that are life-giving, generative, collaborative principles, it starts to really shift and change. So that's the one that came first into my head. But it was a dramatic difference. Just change boring, dry meetings into discovery sessions and treat them that way. Then you actually go into discovery. It will shift how it's one little way to make one practice to make a shift.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much. I want to honor you. You talked about my work over the years and persistence, and I want to honor the same in you as well. That in the 20 or 25 years, we acknowledge that
Right.
you and I both were breaking new ground in Washington, D.C. in the mid 90s. Nobody
Yeah,
else was talking this language, and we've stuck it out. So I'm really happy that you have, and that we've kept in touch over the years.
likewise.
It's really wonderful to have this opportunity to learn more. And it's
Thanks.
inspiring and exciting, and I'm thrilled that we've recorded it. I can't wait to share it with others.
Oh, me too, Michelle. And look forward to more talking. I'm so glad we've reconnected because now's the time. It's almost like I feel like now's the time we've really been waiting for to be able to do this to a new level. So thank you so much for having me. It's great.
You are so welcome. All right.